Yes, so I'm from Redland. I represent people in the south of the city, Mount Cotton and Redland Bay, and until the last election, people in Sheldon. These are all areas that have large acreage properties as opposed to the areas of urban settlement in the north of the city, such as Birkdale, Thornside, Calabar, and so on. We have, over a number of years, been moving away from local laws to manage vegetation to planning regulation to manage vegetation at the instruction of the state government. Which means that when someone wants to manage vegetation on their property, anywhere in the state, our planning regulations are statewide, they're required to treat that as a development application. So they put a planning application in. That's quite a costly thing to do, and of course planners, in order to assess an application, have to have reports to assess. So if you want to remove vegetation under the Planning Act as a development application, you need to put your application in, but then of course you need to identify what the vegetation is. So you'll need an arborist report to identify the vegetation. Then you will need a habitat assessment report to identify what impact removing that vegetation will have on the other vegetation that is around it. Now, in most areas of Queensland, and certainly in the area that I represent, there are local and state significant matters to be considered. So we have protections for waterways, creeks, courses, etc. Then laying over that, we'll have overlays for the vegetation of state significance. So that's particularly under the koala SPRP, koala and native vegetation. And then the law says that councils must protect the state interests, so those vegetation protections at state level must be enforced by councils, but then council can, if it chooses, take further measures. So just recently our council has taken the decision, not based on a need from a department coming forward saying there was a problem, but because of a particular Green councillor who wanted it to happen that way, to make a motion which applies only over the rural areas of our city and outside the urban footprint, to remove the allowance, which is allowed under the state government, of up to 500 square metres of vegetation clearing. So people who live in the rural area, it's very complicated for them to be able to decipher between all the overlays and the conditions, and the state legislation is very complex. So for the people that are living in my area, if they just need to remove a tree, we have an allowance that says up to 500 square metres you can remove that tree. And recently councillors have voted to review that, and that will be removed from my residents if they can't stop it. The incident that Jill was referring to was something that happened to one of my farmers under the koala SPRP. So he has a large property and he has orchards on his property, and he was keen to establish a new section of the property for orchard. The area was predominantly cleared, and he was offered free topsoil from a earth-moving company that was doing work on a nearby development and didn't want to pay to get rid of their soil. So this happens quite regularly in my electorate. A truck driver will come up to a farmer and say, "Would you like some soil, mate?" Because we've got fabulous soil in Redlands, red soil. And of course, nobody wants to see that go to landfill, so they say, "Oh yeah, I can do that, I'll top dress my fields." So unfortunately, under the state planning SPRP, even if you're top filling, if you receive more than one dump truckload of fill, you have to do a cut and fill application. Most of my farmers don't know that. So again, another planning application which requires engineering to prove that you're not changing the flow of overland stormwater and all that kind of stuff before you can accept your free fill. This particular farmer didn't know that either, and the truck drivers brought in truckload after truckload after truckload of fill, and then he spread it across his field and up to the edges of his field, which on the edges of his field he had some large gum trees. Then council officers came along and said, "Where's your cut and fill application?" which of course he didn't have. Then environment officers came along and decided that the fill that he put at the foot of the gum trees meant that those gum trees would die. So he was then required under the regulations to do a tree clearing application for 8 trees. Now, he didn't actually remove 8 trees, he put soil up to the bases of 8 trees, which the environment officers declared would die at some point in the future because of this. So this occurred about 2 years ago, just prior to the latest iteration of SPRP regulations and vegetation protection coming in. So he was spared some level of that application. But essentially, by the time he did his application to remove the trees, had them assessed, had reports for the impact, the habitat assessment, the arborist assessment to see if they could or couldn't be saved, etc. He got to the point where he had spent $34,000 on reports and applications for his 8 trees. He then was required, in order to avoid threats of court and fines, etc., to take the remaining bushland on his property and register an easement over that, making the government the beneficiary of the on title, and he can never use that section of land for anything at all. He can't allow cattle to roam through it or anything like that. He was lucky in that, had he been a little bit later, literally 2 months later, if this had occurred 2 months later, there would not have been an option to take that as a way out, and he would have been triggered up to the state government. And then the fee for the state government to look at it, to decide if they're even interested in it, was around $10,000. So he would have had another $10,000 fee on top of that. So that's the experience of one of my residents in trying to develop his land, which was already a registered agricultural production property for agricultural production. And that's right here, as Jules said, close to Brisbane, within 40 k's of Brisbane. So trying to do these things when you're wanting to feed mulga to cattle and look after your sugarcane in Mackay is really tough with the way these things trigger up and trigger down. And state governments write the legislation which governs local government, and local government employees will go to jail if they don't make sure that those state interests are enforced. So they're not going to muck around, and they never give you any leeway.